really interesting lecture, I think, on the area of race and ethnicity, which is a major subfield in sociology, of course, dealing with all of its central and classical themes around power and inequality and social structure. And race and ethnicity, of course, is a topic brimming with real-world significance today. And I think it's a particularly important issue in sociology to think critically about, since we often have a lot of assumptions about race and ethnicity that are not particularly sociological. So with that said, I'm going to start today with good old Samuel Morton. Now, Dr. Morton, bless you. Okay, Dr. Morton, quite a pleasant chap, yes? Morton was a physician 150 years ago in the States, in Philadelphia. He was considered to be one of the most distinguished men of medicine and science at the time. Now, among other things, Morton would collect human skulls from around the world. And he filled these skulls up with marbles in an effort to try to measure the brain volume, the physical volume of the brain, the space of the brain. And in doing so, he compared across races the size of the skull. And at the time, again, about 150 years ago, he concluded that, interestingly enough, the races that were highest in the social hierarchy, the most successful, the most wealthy, that the races of the most wealthy people in the society had the biggest brains, and that those that ranked lowest in the society, in terms of wealth and power and success, had the smallest brains. So he claimed that the people with the biggest brains were whites of European origin, then next were Asians, then came American Indians, and at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and those with the smallest brains, were blacks. So the sentiment that social hierarchy is highly correlated with biological abilities, and that biological abilities vary systematically by race, was a common theme in colonial America and throughout the world. So the implications of his findings were quite powerful at the time, because in essence what he was saying was that social inequalities have biological roots. That is, they're kind of a natural expression of differences in biological capacities between the races. So, in other words, if on average, members of some racial groups are rich and others are poor, this is a function of the kinds of different mental capacities that come with one's racial background. And as well, because he showed that American Indians and African Americans naturally rested at the bottom of the social hierarchy because they had the smallest brains and the most limited mental capacity. Those ideas then came to justify two of the most oppressive forms of domination in that era, and that would be colonization and slavery. Now, when we look more critically at the evidence that Morton accrued, despite his claims of being scientifically objective, there's actually not much support for his thesis. For example, there are a number of methodological problems, something you always want to be attentive to when you're looking at these kinds of studies on race and ethnicity and differences in intelligence. Things, by the way, that even today, still, there's some sort of a stream of research in this regard. So getting to Morton and the size of the skulls, 71% of the skulls that Morton identified as Negroid were those of women, compared to only 48% of the skulls that he identified as Caucasian. So women's bodies are on average smaller than men's bodies. And on average, the skulls are smaller. So to make a fair comparison, Morton would have to have made sure that the sex composition of the white and the black skulls were identical. He'd have to compare male skulls with male skulls and female skulls with female skulls, right? That would make sense. But he didn't do that. Instead, he compared an average difference in size that's probably attributable to sex, not to race. Actually, if we compare black and white females, the white skulls are 2 cubic inches bigger. That's true. But when we compare black and white males, the white skulls are about 1 cubic inch smaller. So for these and other reasons, Morton's findings are fairly meaningless. Yet these ideas around biological differences as the cause of behavioral differences, as the cause of differences in intelligence and power, have persisted. Here's another interesting example related to IQ. Jews scored below average on IQ tests in the 1920s. Now, this was used as an argument against Jewish immigration. Today, however, Jews typically score above average on IQ tests. So what changed? The genetic makeup of Jews over the course of a few decades did not change enough, certainly, to produce that kind of change in IQ scores. So what really changed to produce a change in the IQ scores? Well, during the 20th century, most North American Jews worked hard, moved up the stratification system. As their fortunes improved, they made sure that their children got superior education and had all of the cultural resources that were necessary for success in society. And as a consequence, average IQ scores went up. Not because of genetic changes, but simply because of changes in socioeconomic status and resources. Similarly, in recent decades, African Americans have, on average, scored below whites on IQ scores. In the US in the 1990s, this below average score on IQ tests was used to justify slashing budgets for inner city schools. And the rationale is, why invest all of this good money when in fact these IQ scores are rooted in biology and there's nothing education can do about that anyway. So the answer sociologically is fairly plain. IQ scores are not rooted in biology and they are not fixed, and the historical record is very clear about that. Now, those that come with a sociological understanding about race and intelligence and achievement do things, have set up resources that clearly make this evident. Here's a quick example. There are a ton of them, but I'll just give you one. In the South Bronx in New York, a pretty rough neighborhood, there were 300 black and Latino students at a school. They were all pretty much written off as students that would probably drop out by the 8th grade. They typically had poor grades, there was high drug use, there was a lot of antisocial behavior, there was a lot of absenteeism. Very few of their predecessors ever went on to college. And so what the school did was it completely revamped the program. It put in a ton of resources, both in terms of computer resources and teaching resources and activities. And as a consequence, today, most students in that school take honors and college-level classes by the time they're seniors. 80% of them go on to college, well above the national average in the US. Now, what changed? Did the genetic nature of intelligence change for these students in the school? No, obviously not. Obviously, achievement and education and even commitment to school has a lot to do with the resources that are available and put into a given institution, not because of anything essential with race and ethnicity. Now, there are other things that we often attribute to race and ethnicity that are equally as problematic when taken from a sociological perspective. So, one of these is athleticism. Some people will say that, as an example, African Americans are better than whites at sports. Why are they better? Because for genetic reasons or because of the structure of their bodies, what have you. Now, at first glance, there may seem to be some supporting evidence for this. If you look at sports as an example, about 60% of NBA players and about 65% of NFL players are black. West African descended blacks hold the 200 fastest 100-meter times, all under 10 seconds. North and East Africans regularly win about 40% of the top international distance running honors, yet they represent only a fraction of the world's population, about 1%. So these kinds of figures and what you see on TV seem to suggest that maybe there's something to this. Maybe, in fact, athleticism is indeed related to race. Well, the facts are undeniable when looking at it from that perspective. But yet, if you look a little more critically into this, particularly if you look historically, you find a bit of a different story, and you need to consider a few other factors. First off, of course, there is no gene that has ever been linked to athletic superiority. But more important than that, forgetting about that, maybe one day they would find it, who knows? We'll give that argument the benefit of the doubt. Athletes of African descent perform very well in certain sports, but do not perform unusually well in some other sports, like swimming, or hockey, or tennis, or cycling, or gymnastics, or soccer. So the idea that people of African descent are in general superior athletes is probably not borne out in the athletic record. If it were true, we'd also have to conclude that blacks tend to lack good hockey genes, or good cycling genes, or good gymnastics genes, which typically are found disproportionately among white Canadians and Russians. So a more credible explanation, a more sociological explanation, is that different groups of people tend to excel in sports due not to genetic factors, but to social structural factors. And maybe climate, as climate is attached to nationality. So for example, scientists have identified certain social conditions that lead to quite high levels of participation in sports. Now these operate on all groups of people, whatever their race. Specifically, people who face widespread prejudice and who have social structural disadvantages due to discrimination. Those groups of people often enter into sports. They also, more than their counterparts, their racial counterparts, may enter into the entertainment industry and crime. So sports, crime, and entertainment tend to be disproportionately constituted by those who are structurally marginalized. And that includes blacks. So think about, for instance, the music industry. And it's not just men from disadvantaged groups, of course. Women, too, from disadvantaged groups, tend more often than their advantaged counterparts to involve themselves in sports, in crime, and in entertainment. Why? Because those are ways out of poverty that don't require the kind of education that is usually more available to those who are advantaged. The chat. Love the chat. All right. Now, we're throwing around these words, prejudice, discrimination. Let's give some definition to those. What is prejudice? Prejudice is an attitude that people employ to judge others on their group's real or imagined characteristics. Discrimination is unfair treatment of people due to their perceived group membership. Okay, I want to return to sports and give you what might be an interesting historic anecdote. Do you know that up until the 1950s, Jews actually played a very prominent role in professional sports, particularly in basketball? Now, if anyone knows anything about professional basketball today, you know this is really fun. For instance, when the New York Knicks played their first game on November 1st of 1946, beating the Toronto Huskies, I might add, the starting lineup of the team consisted of these players: Ossie Schechtman, Stan Stutz, Jake Weber, Ralph Kaplowitz, and Leo Gottlieb. Okay, clearly an all-Jewish squad. Now, as a parallel, Koreans in Japan today face quite a bit of prejudice and discrimination. They often pursue careers in sports in Japan. Now, when Koreans are in Canada, however, they do not often pursue sports, and of course they encounter much less prejudice. Few Koreans become professional athletes. Instead, in Canada, they seem to, the stereotype is, excel in engineering and science. Now, as these examples show, social circumstances have a big impact on the degree to which a given group will invest and pursue things like entertainment, athleticism, and crime. So the idea that people of African descent are genetically superior to whites in athletic ability, you see, is the complement of the idea that they are genetically inferior to whites in intellectual ability. Both ideas have the effect of reinforcing a kind of black-white inequality by linking ability to genetics and to race. By promoting only the LeBron James of the world as suitable role models for black youth, we in effect ask black youth to bet on high-risk propositions in their professional life, and at the same time deflecting attention away from a much safer bet, which is achieving upward mobility through education. Okay, let's turn to look at the concept of race, which itself is a bit tricky sometimes. DNA. What is DNA? DNA is a chemical that contains the genetic instructions for all living organisms. You probably all know this. When people have a child, the child inherits the DNA from both parents. What is DNA? DNA consists of 3 billion pairs of 4 types of molecules. Now this is interesting. Different sequences of molecules result in different characteristics like skin coloring. However, 99.5% of the DNA of all people is identical. 99.5%. So the remaining 0.5% of DNA may differ between any 2 people, and these differences are known as Snips. Snips are the focus of comparative genomic research. So Snips influence physical differences, like skin and pigmentation. They also affect the ability of the body to absorb certain chemicals. So comparative genomics research focuses on the differences in Snips between distinct groups, such as blacks and whites. Now here's something really interesting, though, within this research that we discovered. Genetic diversity is actually greatest among people of African origin. So I'm going to say that again. Genetic diversity is actually the greatest among people of African origin. So in this sense, even the category African or black as a meaningful biological or genetic designation is seriously called into question, because within that category, African, of African descent, is the most genetic variation of any other population that we can identify by region. So since so much genetic diversity exists between people of African origin, or between black people, let's say, what does race then even mean? What does that racial category even mean? Okay, a few points on race, biology, and society. There is no biological evidence that races differ in ways that explain behavioral differences or differences in intelligence between people. As I indicated earlier, IQ scores and things like behavioral differences like educational achievement or athletic achievement, those things are not constant, but in fact change over time and between people. Now, behavioral differences between racial groups vary by things like their social circumstances, their structural location, access to resources, etc. So these are not biological or genetic factors, but they are social factors. Nevertheless, we have this major area of sociology called race and ethnicity. Why? Well, we have it because even though race may not have a significant biological basis, particularly in terms of shaping social outcomes, nevertheless, race exists as something that we construct in the society and as something that people have to contend with. So most sociologists will agree that even as race is largely socially constructed, nevertheless, people have perceptions of race. We have racialized histories. We have racialized social structures. So we have to have an analysis of race and ethnicity. As long as people have perceptions of race, and as long as the world is socially organized in racialized ways, then we have to take race into consideration, even if, at the end of the day, we acknowledge that race and ethnicity are broadly socially constituted. They're socially constructed, and they don't, in and of themselves, by nature, lead to any particular kind of socioeconomic outcome or social outcome. So we know that race doesn't exist as a factor that naturally produces social status, but we also know that socially and culturally race is important, and so we have to keep our eye on it. All right, a few examples of changing constructions of race over time. You may not know this, but about a century ago, Irish folks and Jews were regarded as blacks. Irish and Jews were regarded as blacks by many people. Today, many northern Italians still think of southern Italians from Sicily and Calabria as black. So these examples may seem a bit preposterous. Irish people are considered black? Huh? But actually, they show that racial distinctions are socially constructed and that they change over time. And why do they change? They change as positions in power, in the field of power change. So many sociologists, particularly Canadian sociologists who've taken the lead on this, like to talk less about race and more about racialization. Okay? So racialization, and not so much race, because race has a kind of essential connotation, the connotation that someone is of this race or that race. It seems to have a kind of biological and genetic connotation. Sociologists instead want to focus on the construction of that connotation. The construction of race is something that's real. And in that sense, we get to this idea of racialization. What is it? We can think about it at two levels of analysis. So at the individual level, at the interactional level, what is race, or what is racialization? A social process whereby dispositional attributions are made based on physical characteristics associated with racial or ethnic heritage. Now, we've used that term before, dispositional attributions. And you'll recall, we say that we make a dispositional attribution when we make judgments about someone's character based on things other than their character. So maybe like the way they dress, the way they wear their hat, the way they wear their hair. We can sometimes make dispositional attributions when we assume something about that person based on something they're wearing, as an example. Now similarly here, racialization is making an assessment of someone's personality or their character based on a racial or ethnic appearance. Now most people do this, whether you believe in race or not, so to speak, whether you want to or not, many of us make these kinds of connections. As an example, it's been found over and over, culturally and in social scientific research, that like if you're in a street walking at night and you see a black person, you may be more concerned about a criminal activity than if you see a white person. Why? Because you're making a dispositional attribution based on the color of someone's skin. You're saying, if that person is black as opposed to white, they're probably more likely to be involved in crime as opposed to a white person. So therefore, I should worry. So that's an example of a racialization process at the individual interactional level, where you see a person of a particular racial designation and you make an assumption in your mind about that person, about that person's character. Okay, so in that sense, we have this tendency to racialize others. We attribute to them certain character traits based on their physical appearance, even when that may not be warranted at all, obviously. There's a really interesting bit of research that's been done in cognitive science, and it's something you can Google later if you want, called the study of implicit attitudes. The study of implicit attitudes. And this is a study some of you may have participated in, and a lot of college students did. It was available on the internet for anyone who wanted to take it. I don't know if it still is, this was a couple of years ago. But it was a set of photographs that would be flashed before on your screen. And you had to immediately say you liked it or you didn't, you preferred it or you didn't, or you would want to have dinner with this person or you wouldn't want to have dinner with this person. Those kinds of questions. Okay, so like immediate, sort of almost reflexive kinds of responses to these images. And they had studies on aging, how we perceive age and how we perceive race. And over, what the studies on implicit attitudes showed was that people had negative responses to black people and more positive responses to white people. Criminality and negative intentions were more likely to be attributed to black people than white people. Beauty was more likely to be attributed to the young than to the old. So even at the beginning, a lot of times these implicit attitude studies have these quick surveys that you take. And they try to assess your attitudes about the elderly or your attitudes about race. And then they give you the implicit attitudes test. And very often, what do you think they find? They find that there's this remarkable disjunct between what people report on the survey in terms of their attitudes toward a given race or the elderly, and their implicit attitudes. Their implicit attitudes tend to rest on stereotypical constructions of race and age. Whereas when they think about it and they have to answer a question on a survey, maybe more of their conscious mind is at play there. They don't show those kinds of implicit attitudes. So we have explicit attitudes on the one hand and implicit attitudes on the other. Explicit meaning mostly conscious, implicit meaning mostly automatic and perhaps unconscious. So racialization is something that occurs even if you think you are not a quote-unquote racist person or an ageist person or a sexist person.
Sorry.
Even if you